The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, dragging curtains of white snow across the frozen earth. Daniel Harper had lived through many winters on his lonely ranch, but this storm was different. The sky had turned gray before noon, and by late afternoon the blizzard was raging so violently that the world outside his cabin had disappeared completely. Snow slammed against the wooden walls, and the wind forced its way through every crack as if it wanted to tear the house apart. Inside the cabin, the fire burned strong, yet Daniel still felt the cold creeping in through the floorboards. But the cold was not what frightened him. The sound that filled the small cabin was far worse, a weak cry. His baby daughter Emma lay wrapped in blankets on the small bed near the fireplace. Her tiny face was pale, her breathing shallow and uneven. Daniel sat beside her, his rough rancher hands trembling as he touched her forehead again. It was burning hot. Fever. 2 days ago, she had been smiling and grabbing his finger with her tiny hands. Now she barely had the strength to cry. Daniel cursed under his breath. The nearest doctor was 20 miles away in the small frontier town of Red Creek. In good weather, the ride would take 3 hours. Tonight it was impossible. No horse could survive that storm. The blizzard outside roared louder, rattling the shutters like a warning from the mountains themselves. Daniel stood and paced the narrow cabin floor, running his hands through his dark beard in frustration. He had faced wild horses, drought, and even outlaws on the frontier, but nothing had ever made him feel as helpless as watching his child slowly fade in front of him. Emma let out another weak cry that barely rose above the wind. Daniel knelt beside the bed again, his voice soft and desperate. "Hang on, little one. Just hang on." The wind suddenly slammed against the door with such force that Daniel spun around, instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. Another heavy thump followed. Not like wind this time. Something had hit the door. Daniel approached cautiously, rifle ready. The storm screamed outside like a living thing. Then came a faint knocking. Not the violent pounding of wind. Knocking. Daniel froze. No one could possibly be traveling in this blizzard. Slowly he pulled the door open. A blast of icy wind exploded into the cabin, blowing snow across the floor. Standing in the doorway was a small figure nearly buried in snow. A girl. She looked no older than 12. Her coat was thin and torn, her boots crusted with ice. Snow clung to her dark hair and eyelashes. She swayed as if she might collapse any second. Daniel quickly pulled her inside and slammed the door shut against the storm. The girl staggered near the fire, shivering violently. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "Where in God's name did you come from?" She didn't answer right away. Her lips were blue with cold. Daniel grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, guiding her closer to the fire. After a moment, the girl lifted her head and looked around the cabin, her eyes suddenly fixed on the small bed near the fireplace. The baby. She stepped toward Emma slowly. Daniel frowned. "Easy there, you're half frozen yourself." But the girl ignored him. She leaned over the bed and studied the infant carefully, her expression suddenly serious despite her exhaustion. "The baby is sick," she whispered. Daniel nodded grimly. "Fever. I was hoping it would pass, but it keeps getting worse." The girl gently touched Emma's tiny hand. Then she looked back at Daniel with surprising calm. "If the fever rises more, she will stop breathing." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "You a doctor?" The girl shook her head. "No, but my grandmother was a healer. She taught me things." Daniel hesitated. The storm howled outside and the cabin creaked under the pressure of the wind. The girl stepped closer to the fire and slowly removed the snow-soaked scarf from around her neck. "My name is Lila," she said quietly. Daniel studied her. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were sharp, filled with an unusual determination. "I'm Daniel," he said. "That's Emma." Lila nodded and returned her attention to the baby. She carefully lifted one of the blankets and felt the baby's chest and forehead again. "The fever is strong, but I know a way to help her breathe easier." Daniel leaned closer. "What do you need?" Lila looked toward the dark window where the storm raged like a white wall beyond the glass. There are herbs that grow near the frozen creek not far from here. Daniel stared at her as if she had just suggested jumping off a cliff. You want to go out in that storm? Lila shook her head. Not you, me. Daniel laughed once in disbelief. You're barely standing. Lila's voice became firm. The herbs must be fresh. If we wait until morning, the baby may not survive the night. The words struck Daniel like a hammer. He looked at Emma again. Her tiny chest rose and fell weakly under the blankets. Outside, the wind screamed louder, as if warning them both that the night was only getting worse. Daniel looked back at the girl. The snow still clung to her hair, but her expression remained steady. You really think you can help her? Lila nodded slowly. Yes, but I must hurry. Daniel stepped toward the door and stared into the blinding white storm beyond the window. No 12-year-old should be walking into a blizzard alone. But the desperate sound of Emma's breathing behind him made the choice feel impossible. He turned back toward the girl. Lila was already wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders, preparing to step back into the storm. Daniel opened his mouth to protest again, but the words caught in his throat as Emma let out another weak cry behind them. The cabin fell silent, except for the roar of the wind outside. Daniel looked from the fragile baby to the determined young girl standing near the door. Finally, he spoke quietly. If you go out there, you might not find your way back. Lila placed her hand on the door latch and looked back at him with calm eyes far older than her years. Then she said something that made Daniel's heart sink. I know the snow paths better than the storm does. And with that, she slowly opened the door as the blizzard roared into the cabin and stepped out into the white darkness. And with that, she slowly opened the door as the blizzard roared into the cabin and stepped out into the white darkness. For a second, Daniel could see her small figure fighting against the wind, the snow already swallowing her footprints. Then the storm closed around her, and she was gone. Daniel slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing hard. The cabin suddenly felt too quiet, except for the storm screaming outside. He turned back toward the small bed near the fire. Emma's breathing was weaker now, each tiny breath sounding like a fragile struggle. Daniel knelt beside her and wrapped another blanket around the baby, gently rocking her, as if motion alone could keep life inside her small body. Hang on, little one, he whispered, though his voice carried more fear than hope. Outside, the blizzard showed no mercy. The wind hurled snow against the cabin walls like handfuls of sand thrown by an angry giant. Daniel paced the floor again, glancing again and again at the door. A 12-year-old girl had just walked into one of the worst storms he had ever seen. The thought made his stomach twist with guilt. Minutes passed like hours. The fire crackled loudly, but it did little to calm the fear growing inside him. He kept listening for the sound of footsteps or a knock at the door, but the storm drowned out everything. After nearly 20 minutes, Daniel could not stand it any longer. He grabbed his coat and rifle and moved toward the door. Just as his hand reached the latch, he heard something faint beyond the wind. Scraping. Then a weak thud against the door. Daniel yanked it open. A wave of snow blasted inside, and there she was. Lila stood in the doorway, bent forward against the storm, clutching something in her frozen hands. Her face was pale, and her eyelashes were coated with ice, but her eyes were still focused. Daniel pulled her inside quickly and slammed the door again. Lila staggered toward the fire, breathing hard. Her hands trembled as she opened her fist. Inside was a small bundle of dark green leaves and thin roots tied together with a strip of cloth. Daniel stared at them as if they were gold. You actually found them? Lila nodded weakly. Near the creek rocks where the snow drifts less. Her fingers were nearly numb, but she moved quickly toward the fire and knelt beside Emma. We must boil water, she said. Daniel rushed to the stove and placed a kettle over the flame. Lila crushed the leaves carefully with the back of a spoon while the water heated. The cabin filled with a strange, sharp smell from the herbs, something earthy and bitter. When the water began to boil, she dropped the crushed mixture inside and waited quietly while the steam rose into the cold air. Daniel watched every movement with desperate hope. After a few minutes, Lila dipped a cloth into the hot herbal water and wrung it out gently. Then she placed the warm cloth on Emma's tiny chest and forehead. The baby stirred weakly. Lila repeated the process slowly, again and again, letting the herbal steam surround the child. "This will help her breathe and lower the fever," Lila explained softly. Daniel crouched beside them, his large hands gripping the edge of the bed. Outside, the storm continued its endless roar, but inside the cabin, the only sound now was the quiet rhythm of Lila working patiently. Minutes stretched on. Then something changed. Emma's breathing grew slightly deeper. Daniel noticed it first and leaned closer. The tiny chest that had been rising weakly now moved with a little more strength. The fevered redness on her face slowly began to fade. Lila kept replacing the cloth with steady hands until the kettle finally ran low. When she placed the cloth down one last time, Emma gave a soft cry, stronger than before. Daniel felt something inside his chest loosen for the first time all night. "Is she?" he began. Lila nodded gently. "The fever is breaking. She will be weak for a day or two, but she will live." Daniel sat back heavily on the chair beside the bed, running a hand over his tired face. For a long moment he could not speak. He simply watched his daughter breathe, each breath now steady and calm. Finally, he looked toward Lila. The girl sat near the fire again, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Her small shoulders trembled as the warmth returned to her frozen body. Daniel stood and walked over slowly. "You saved her life," he said quietly. Lila looked up at him with tired eyes. "My grandmother said knowledge is meant to be used when someone needs it." Daniel nodded once, deeply. "Well, tonight that knowledge saved my little girl." He poured a cup of warm water and handed it to her. Lila drank slowly, the color returning to her cheeks. The storm outside slowly began to quiet as the hours passed. By early morning, the wind had weakened, and the snow drifted gently instead of screaming across the plains. Daniel stepped outside just after sunrise. The land was buried under thick white snow, but the sky above was finally clear blue. He stood there for a moment, breathing the cold morning air before returning inside. Emma slept peacefully in her blankets. Lila was asleep near the fire, curled under a blanket Daniel had placed over her during the night. Daniel sat down beside the bed and watched them both. One tiny baby who had nearly died. One brave 12-year-old girl who had walked into a deadly blizzard without hesitation to save her. The rancher who had once believed he faced the wilderness alone realized something that morning. Sometimes the smallest heroes arrive when the storm is at its worst. And sometimes the courage of a child is stronger than the fury of a blizzard.